Native American Tribes, The History and Culture of the Pawnee. Written by Charles River Editors. Narrated by James Weipert. Introduction. All things in the world are two. In our minds we are two, good and evil. With our eyes we see two things, things that are fair and things that are ugly. We have the right hand that strikes and makes for evil, and we have the left hand full of kindness near the heart. One foot may lead us to an evil way, the other foot may lead us to a good. So are all things two, all two. Letakos-Lesa, Eagle Chief, a member of the Pawnee. From the Trail of Tears to Wounded Knee and Little Bighorn, the narrative of American history is incomplete without the inclusion of the Native Americans that lived on the continent before European settlers arrived in the 16th and 17th centuries. Since the first contact between natives and settlers, tribes like the Sioux, Cherokee, and Navajo have both fascinated and perplexed outsiders with their history, language, and culture. In Charles River Editor's Native American Tribes series, you can get caught up to speed on the history and culture of North America's most famous native tribes in the time it takes to finish a commute, while learning interesting facts long forgotten or never known. One of the most famous Native American tribes on the Great Plains is the Pawnee, and they were also once one of the strongest groups in the region. At the turn of the 19th century, there were about 10,000 members spread across much of modern-day Nebraska, Kansas, South Dakota, and even into Missouri and Iowa. The Pawnee were able to thrive despite having strong neighbors to their west, most notably the Arapaho and the Lakota Sioux, and though the different Pawnee bands were autonomous, they also recognized the need to cooperate with each other to face various threats. For several centuries, the Pawnee lived in relatively sedentary communities, relying on agriculture in what is today known as America's breadbasket, and anthropologists have found Pawnee settlements that date all the way back to the 13th century. Inevitably, however, European contact began to drastically affect the Pawnee's lifestyle, especially when horses were introduced to their societies. Like other groups on the plains, the Pawnee eventually became more reliant on buffalo and thus more nomadic. Like other Native American groups in the region, the westward push by American settlers led to conflicts that nearly wiped out all of the Pawnee by the latter half of the 19th century. Nonetheless, the Pawnee were resilient enough to have their numbers bounce back, even as their lands were taken and they moved onto reservations. Today, the Pawnee live on reservations that are only a fraction of the size of the vast expanses they once controlled. Introductory note. Spelling of proper names of individuals, various Native American groups, and geographic locations can vary due to historical, cultural, and linguistic tradition. In this text, application of the singular Pawnee rather than Pawnees is used according to scholarly anthropological criteria, notwithstanding the fact that several groups use the plural. There has been confusion about these two terms since the language family was first defined in the 1890s. Generally speaking, and specifically in this book, the term Caddo refers only to the language spoken historically in Texas, while Caddoan is used to refer to the language family in general. In other words, the Pawnee spoke a Caddoan language, but not Caddo. Chapter 1. The Pawnee Language and the Origins of the Pawnee. While it is not the only way to define their culture, language has historically been one of the strongest identifiers for the Pawnee, and until the 20th century, being Pawnee meant required speaking the Pawnee language. For scholars, the Pawnee language has an additional use of providing information about the history of the Pawnee and their related ethnic groups, such as the Caddo and the Wichita. The Pawnee language has been classified by historical linguists as part of the Caddoan language family, which means that the Pawnee and the other languages within this group can all be traced back to a single ancestral language. Over centuries and possibly even millennia, this language splintered into several branches, and in time the branches developed into distinctive languages or dialects whose speakers cannot understand the speech of someone speaking one of the other branches. Some language families have hundreds of tongues spread across vast spaces. For instance, the Indo-European language family includes English, Greek, Hindi, Bengali, and almost every language between them. The Niger-Congo language family includes almost every language in sub-Saharan Africa, including Swahili, Zulu, and Yoruba. In fact, there is often such a diversity of languages that speakers of different tongues often have no idea that their languages share a common origin, consisting of links that are typically discovered only through careful academic study. The Caddoan language family is a much smaller group than either of the two previous examples. Historically, the group was divided at the point of European contact into two main branches, the North and South branches. The South branch was made up of only the Caddo language of what is today eastern Texas, western Arkansas, and northern Louisiana, while the Northern branch included several branches, Wichita, Kitsai, Adai, and Pawnee, and was found in communities located along the fertile river valleys of modern-day Kansas and Nebraska. While Kitsai and Adai are today extinct, a small number of speakers of the other languages continue to use them, and along with good records of all of the tongues, there is good record of the Caddoan language family. This knowledge allows linguists to use a technique called glottochronology, which is a way of dating languages based on comparing their differences. Glottochronology is based upon the observation that languages change their pronunciations with a predictable tempo, so while linguistics cannot predict exactly when or how a language will change, when they average up the changes over time, a subtle average frequency appears. This means that when linguists compare two languages known to share a common ancestor, they can tally up the number of pronunciation differences and then make estimates on how long ago the two language communities separated. Linguists examining deep grammatical structures have argued that the Caddoan languages share an ancestral link with the Iroquoian languages of New York and Central Appalachia, as well as the Siouan speakers, the Lakota, Crow, Mandan, Omaha of the northern Great Plains. This ancestral population may have lived in the central Mississippi Valley as far back as 10,000 years ago, making it one of the first languages spoken in North America after the departure of the glaciers. However, the extremely ancient nature of this language means that scholars will never be able to learn any more than the barest of details with certainty. More concretely, linguists using glottochronology have been able to estimate that the oldest surviving division in the Caddoan family is between Caddo, the southern language, and the various northern branches. This information has been combined with archaeological research to demonstrate that the ancestors of the modern Caddo have inhabited the valleys of the Ouachita, Red, Sabine, and Neches rivers south of the Arkansas River for over 1,000 years and perhaps as many as 4,000 years. This may have been the first place that they settled after their departure from the central Mississippi Valley, but since this time depth is definitely not true of any of the homelands of the northern branches, scholars have surmised that the Caddoan peoples were living in eastern Texas and Arkansas, and that the northern branches are the descendants of peoples who migrated out of this ancient homeland, probably in search of new agricultural territories. While the split between northern and southern groups was already well developed, scholarship has shown that two dialects of ancient Caddoan began to split perhaps 3,500 years ago, at first into two dialects of the same language. Roughly 2,000 years ago, the ancestors of the Wichita began to split from the languages that would become Kitsai Pawnee Arikara, but the Kitsai split off only a few centuries later. The Pawnee and Arikara languages only separated somewhere around 4 or 5 centuries ago. All of these groups were eventually spaced out along the western tributaries of the Mississippi in a south-to-north pattern. The Caddo were the southernmost group, followed by the Kitsai and Wichita, the first two groups to split off from the northern migration, which were both settled around the basin of the Arkansas River. Further north in Nebraska and northern Kansas were the Pawnee, and finally there were the Arikara in today's Dakotas. Within the Pawnee population, there were a number of linguistic and cultural subdivisions. The northernmost group was the Skiri Band, who lived along the north side of the Loup River, and had such a unique dialect that the other groups considered them somewhat distinct from the rest. On the south bank of the Platte River and the Republican River were three groups: the Chawis, the Kitahakis, and the Pitahawiratas, all of whom spoke a single shared dialect. The Pawnee language is radically different from any language that most Europeans or Americans are accustomed to, and an example of it is useful for anyone trying to understand the Pawnee and how difficult it has been for them to maintain their distinct tongue in the modern era. The following quote was taken from an interview with a Pawnee elder who spoke on the traditional customs of his people. The first line is in Pawnee, the second is the direct translation word for word into English, and the third is a loose translation into English. Rawa tatika ratkura, iwati eras ruruksta tawa kuki rura pakutu, iri shuki sektpa wis ratara kuki rakuru rakura iwikuriki. Now I want for me to tell the customs we had the old ways than whatever they learned our people the way for them to depend on. Now I wish to tell about the customs we had in the old days when the people learned these ways for their survival. Traditionally, the Pawnee did not call themselves by that name, instead preferring the name Chahik si Chahiks or Men of Men. The term Pawnee is believed to be an English corruption of the term pariki, which means horn, a reference to the distinctive traditional hairstyle used by Pawnee men. The term is not considered to be offensive, however, and the Pawnee Nation uses it in all of their English correspondence and websites. That said, the Pawnee language name is used in their Great Seal and on their nation newsletter. Furthermore, due to the difficulty in expressing the Pawnee language in English writing, there are two alternative Pawnee and one English name for each of the bands. Readers who continue the study of the Pawnee may find any of these names used, including 1. Skiri, Skidi, or Loop Pawnee. 2. Chawi, Jawi, or Grand Pawnee. 3. Kitkahaki, Kitkehakai, or Republican Pawnee. 4. Pitahawarita, Pitaaurirat, or Tapaj Pawnee. Here are 20 other common words in the Pawnee language. 1. Asku. 2. Pitku. 3. Tawit. 4. Skitiks. 5. Sihuks. Man. Pita. Woman. Sapat. Dog. Asakis. Sun. Sakuru. Moon. Pa. Water. Kitsu. White. Taka. Yellow. Rakatar. Red. Pahat. Black. Katit. To see. Irit. To sing. Raruku. Chapter 2. Elements of Pawnee Society. This chapter examines the basic structures of Pawnee society as they existed before Euro-American contact and throughout the 19th century. These institutions were largely shattered by the Indian Wars, as well as the terrible price of death from disease and the forcible relocation of the Pawnee to reservations. But the description in this chapter should not give the impression that they were timeless and unchanging before contact with white Europeans and white settlers. Instead, the description offers a snapshot of a society that had undergone thousands of years of development, including moving across a continent and interacting with countless other societies and traditions. What makes this snapshot interesting is that it is the last point of that cultural evolution before the inexorable wave of European and American conquest and displacement. So historians studying it can trace the roots of this society in the past and also examine how it adapted under the great pressures that later came. The traditional level of social organization was a group known in English as a band, a term that is now widely used for politically autonomous subdivision of indigenous ethnic groups in the American West. In the post-contact period, the Pawnee had 4 bands: the Skiri, the Chawi, the Kitkahaki, and the Pitahawirata, each with its own territory and governmental structures. By the time of contact with whites, Each band was associated with a single village, though it is known from oral history and other records that there had previously been multiple villages per band, and up to over a dozen for the large northern Skiri. When bands controlled single villages, the band village was controlled by 4 leaders, one of whom was considered to be the overall head. While transfer of power was generally hereditary, it was also possible for a member to ascend to the leadership position via military prowess. Each of the 4 leaders had a household which included not only his family, but also a retinue of 4 warriors, an individual with a role similar to a town crier or herald whose job it was to move about the community making announcements, and a number of male servants referred to as boys. In conjunction with the political organization of the village band, there was also a structure of religious leaders which included both priests and doctors. The priestly order, called the Kurahus, was dedicated to celestial gods, and their emphasis was upon social order. The priests were mediators in disputes aimed to appease the gods for the promotion of good fortune, and perhaps most importantly, they held the sacred knowledge of the rituals associated with the village's sacred bundle. In each Pawnee settlement, there was a sacred bundle comprised of a buffalo skin that was used to wrap up a collection of holy relics, and that bundle was officially protected within the household of the village's head leader and was owned and cared for by his wife. Women owned the bundles and passed them along their family lines, but only the male Kurahus knew the rituals that used the bundle, which they believed would bring good weather, fertility, and successful hunts and battles. There was no generalized sacred bundle because each was a unique collection of artifacts. For example, a bundle currently under the stewardship of the Kansas State Historical Society is still carefully bound up, just as it was by the last Kurahus to use it, and on the outside the priest tied a long pipe, arrow fragments, a meat fork tipped with a raccoon bone, and small American flags. The society has x-rayed the packet and found it filled with stuffed bird bundles, hawk bells, counting sticks, and glass beads sewn on a leather strip. The American flags may seem strange, but the family that owned it before donating it to the society in 1987 had, like most 19th century Pawnee, been closely allied to the United States government, and one of their other precious heirlooms was a peace medal, a medallion with the current president's face on it that was given to Allied Native leaders. The Society's bundle has not been opened in over a century out of respect, and like some other Native American sacred objects, such as Hopi kachinas, the bundle was seen as having some of the properties of a living being. In particular, it was believed to go to sleep when it was tied up, and that it needed to be awakened using a ritual involving a blemish-free new ear of corn before it could be opened. To do otherwise was an act of deep disrespect, and even violence to the bundle. And when the last Kurahus guarding the Society's bundle was killed by the Lakota Sioux in the late 19th century, the rituals associated with the bundle were lost. As a result, the family kept it out of respect and pride, but was never able to properly open it again, and the Society has followed suit. The other religious official amongst the Pawnee was the doctor, or Kura'u. While the priests worshipped the gods of the heavens, the doctor's deities were found on earth and were primarily the spirits of the animals and birds. The Kura'u encountered these patron beings through their dreams, often when ill, and the Pawnee believed the deities conveyed power to priests for both curing and cursing. Different animal spirits were associated with various powers that they gave as boons to their Kura'u. In these ways, the Kura'u were similar to the shamanic healers of other Great Plains groups, but the Pawnee did have one distinctive wrinkle with their concept of an animal lodge. The lodge was an animal echo of the lodges in which the Kura'u gathered. Animal doctors were believed to congregate and perform rituals in hidden places underwater or under the banks of a river, so young men seeking their power would fall asleep on the riverbank in hopes that the animal Kura'u would take him below and bless him. Before contact with Europeans, the Pawnee engaged in a complex series of economic activities over the course of the year that was governed by the life cycles of numerous domesticated plants and the migration patterns of wild animals. In the spring, they lived in permanent riverside villages made up of tight clusters of semi-subterranean buildings called earth lodges. They returned to their fields, and the women planted gardens of corn, beans, and squash, the so-called Three Sisters of Native American agriculture. In parallel, the men performed rituals within the lodges that were believed to guarantee good harvests. The rhythm of agricultural life was broken up in June when the community moved out to the high plains to the west for the summer bison hunt. After the migrating bison passed through, they returned back to the permanent villages in August in order to be present for the corn harvest. This was followed by the winter bison hunt between October and November, when the great herds moved south again, and finally they returned back to the earth lodges in February or March. This pattern of shifting exploitation of different economic resources in different areas of a group's territory is not true nomadism, which involves continuous, non-repetitive movement, but it is referred to by the term transhumance. All of the Caddoan groups practiced some similar form of subsistence strategy, but the Pawnee put a far greater emphasis upon the bison than their cultural cousins did. For example, the Arikara also derived much of their sustenance from fishing the rivers and from trade with other groups. Trade has always been an important part of Pawnee economic life, but they tended to meet their own basic subsistence needs, including food, shelter, and clothing, without having to trade. That said, trade was vitally important for obtaining prestigious goods that helped to bolster the power and respect given to chiefs. The Pawnee would acquire skins and furs from bison for trade downriver, and would acquire all sorts of goods from their partners depending upon the time period. In the pre-Columbian era, this included fired pottery, seashell beads, and fine bows, and after the arrival of the Europeans, it included metal tools and factory-made goods. One important element of the late pre-Columbian trade networks is the presence of goods imported from what is now the American Southwest, showing that the Pawnee were not limited to the opportunities provided by life around the Mississippi. Like many other Great Plains groups, the Pawnee spent much of their year in earth lodges, a particularly ancient form of housing. Examples of similar structures have been found by archaeologists going back centuries in the region. The basic form is of a single circular room which ranged in diameter from as much as 60 to as little as 20 feet across and 1 foot deep. The ceiling was domed and was held up by at least 4 support poles and occasionally 12 poles. These posts had forked ends on top, onto which were placed horizontal supports. From this central support structure, a set of sloping beams spread out like spokes on a bike wheel to a second ring of pillars, which leaned away from the center, and this ring was located a few feet from the exterior wall. This exterior wall was formed of horizontal poles attached to the beams across the top of the outer circle. Both the roof and the outer wall were covered in a tight latticework of willow branches, which was topped by grass thatching which covered with a thick layer of turf-covered earth. There were 2 openings in the walls, a hole in the center for light, smoke, and stargazing, and a tunnel-like doorway typically facing east. Today, the Great Plains groups are associated with teepees, but this is a stereotype that came from the increased bison hunting of the era after the introduction of the horse, and it was never completely true. The Pawnee did spend part of their year in teepees during the annual bison hunts, but they invested far more energy in their earth lodge villages. These villages were often densely packed, sometimes with several hundred lodges each holding around 20 individuals, and some were known to have been fortified with walls. While this was beneficial for defense and collective action before the horse, it proved fatal when European diseases devastated many of the tightly packed communities. Cross-cutting the Pawnee bands were a number of family lines, referred to in academic literature as gents or clans. These were groups of families who traced their ancestry back to a single shared progenitor who lived in the mythic past, similar to the Romans seeing themselves as descended from the brothers Romulus and Remus, or the Jews tracing their ancestry to the patriarchs of the 12 tribes. Like many Native American groups, the Pawnee lineages were associated with powerful animal spirits, including the bear, beaver, eagle, buffalo, deer, and owl. There were probably more lineages historically, but these are the only ones that have survived in the records or until modern time. Family lines among the Pawnee are traced along female lines, which meant that an individual joined the lineage of his or her mother at birth and kept that lineage throughout their life. Likewise, the two most important pieces of property, the Earth Lodge and the Sacred Bundle, were passed from mother to daughter. After marriage, the young couple would move into the Earth Lodge of the wife's family, and marriage was prohibited amongst members of the same lineage since they were considered to be kinfolk. These lineages cross-cut Pawnee society, so bands and villages frequently contained an Earth Lodge with members of the different lineages. This meant that a Pawnee traveling from one band's territory into another might be able to find kinfolk of the same lineage in distant villages, and that also made violent conflict between Pawnee bands less likely because people had family in the other bands. Friendly contacts between bands helped negotiate settlements for various conflicts, and when Pawnee bands faced exterior threats like the Lakota, they were able to draw upon allies from other bands who could be expected to defend their family members. Chapter 3. Before the Horse. Although Pawnee history extends far back, the lack of written records makes their history murky aside from the past few centuries. As a result, scholars typically deal with the Pawnee's more recent history and divide it into three periods. The first is the era before the arrival of the horse, which occurred in 1541 when the Spanish conquistador Francisco de Coronado led a massive expedition into what is now the American Southwest, searching for the legendary 7 cities of Cibola, which were rumored to be constructed of gold. The horse would forever transform the plains peoples and the way they made their livelihoods and fought their wars. As noted above, linguistic evidence suggests that the earliest Caddoans dwelt in the Mississippi River Valley sometime around 10,000 years ago, when they split off from other groups that eventually became the Iroquoians and the Siouans. This group moved about the Mississippi region before settling in the upper valleys of the Mississippi's western tributaries. The Caddoans did not settle in the lowest areas of the Mississippi Basin, the great floodplain known as the American Bottom, but instead in the drier, less fertile upper reaches of the tributary rivers, thin bands of agricultural land surrounded by vast plains. Regardless of the exact period of their history, the Caddoan peoples have always lived along the western tributaries of the Mississippi River. At some point, about 4,000 years ago, the Caddoans had settled in the region that is today eastern Texas and western Arkansas, and at that point they began to bifurcate into northern and southern groups. In the early 1000s, the American Bottom and the Ohio and Missouri River valleys were the center of a diverse and powerful series of societies known in general as the Mississippians. The Mississippians were agriculturalists who organized themselves into a form of government called a chiefdom, a pre-state, kinship-based society that typically has at least 1,000 people and at least 2 social classes led by a hereditary leader, often called a chief or cacique by Europeans. The chiefdoms were characterized by a tribute economy. In this economic system, farmers provided a portion of their crops to the local chief as tribute, and the chief kept some of the crops for himself and his family and followers, with some of the crops being redistributed back to the farmers to reward for good behavior, and some of them given in tribute to the chief superior, a paramount chief. The paramount chief also used some of the produce and redistributed the rest as a reward, so the economic system bolstered the political system and vice versa. The Mississippian societies were characterized by rigid division between the nobility, who lived in elaborate houses built upon massive earthen mounds, and the commoners who farmed corn, beans, and squash in the valleys. The Mississippian culture lasted from the early 1000s to the 1600s, when the societies collapsed due to the devastation of European diseases, but throughout that time they never unified into a single political grouping. Although the societies remained a patchwork of rival fiefdoms that often warred with each other, the largest and most important of the settlements was the great city of Cahokia near modern-day St. Louis, which flourished between 1050 and 1150 AD, and was the largest pre-Columbian city north of the Rio Grande. The largest structure at Cahokia was a massive platform mound 10 stories in height with 4 terraces. Known as Monk's Mound, it is the largest man-made earthen mound north of Mexico. Developed over the course of several centuries, through at least 10 separate construction periods, Monk's Mound was aptly named for the community of Trappist monks that resided there for a short time after European settlement. Excavation of the peak of the mound has revealed evidence of a 5,000 square foot building, 105 feet long by 48 feet wide by 50 feet high, presumably a temple or residence of the supreme chief that could have been seen from virtually any place in the city. This cultural effusion in the American bottom had a tremendous effect upon the Caddoans, especially upon those, like the Proto-Pawnee, who had been slowly moving north from the original homeland and closer to the orbit of Cahokia. Sometime around the 1100s, these Caddoans began to spread out of their heartland initially up north into the Arkansas Basin and into the Ozarks and the Arkansas River Valley based around the settlement at Spiro. Spiro was nowhere near the size of Cahokia, but it became the westernmost chiefdom and the only one that archaeologists can definitively state was related to the northern Caddoans, the ancestors of the Pawnee. Spiro lasted until roughly the 1450s and flourished by controlling the river trade between the upland bison ranges and the downriver Mississippian trade centers. Bison products like furs, horns, meat, and bones moved downriver, while prestige goods like bows, beads, and shells moved upriver. Spiro straddled this river of wealth. Upriver from these centralized governments, the bulk of the Caddoan population spread out along an increasing number of valleys, always striving further northwards into the territories of the Sioux peoples. Around the 15th century, the Pawnee had arrived in their historic territories in what is now central Nebraska, and their cousins the Arikara had already split off and driven northwards into the valleys of the Dakotas. By the time the Europeans arrived on the continent, there were at least 10,000 Pawnee, not to mention the other Caddoans, divided up across numerous villages of varying size and power. At the time of European contact, the lack of domesticated draft animals forced the Pawnee to rely on rivers because the only easy, quick, or efficient way to move people or goods was via the waterways. Of course, they also needed the water for agriculture, drinking, and other household needs. As a result, crossing the plains with a military force would have been daunting, since the warriors would have needed to bring all of their food and much of their water with them on their backs for long distances. Thus, power was focused upon the intricate network of waterways in the Mississippi Basin, so that the American bottom was not only important because of its rich agricultural lands, but also for its central location where all of these trade routes met. The Mississippians, including the early Caddoans, focused their power on the control of rivers, often building their largest fortified settlements, like Spiro or Cahokia, at the river's junctions. Chapter 4. Europeans and Horses. In the 1540s, 2 expeditions led by Spanish conquistadors passed through the Pawnee and Mississippian world, the first being Hernando de Soto's expedition from 1539 to 1541, and then Francisco de Coronado's journey in 1541. Both of these groups were parties consisting of several hundred Spaniards, enslaved native porters and servants, horses, and a vast herd of foraging pigs. They cut swaths through what is now the United States, De Soto through the southeast, and Coronado in the southwest. It's likely that the Spaniards' horses and sheep were the first such animals the Pawnee had ever seen. These events, especially Coronado's group, permanently changed the lives of the Pawnee because they brought 2 new sets of species in their wake: germs and domesticated animals. Cholera and smallpox subsequently devastated Native American communities, especially the closely packed urban settlements of the Mississippian tradition, while domesticated animals, especially the horse, allowed new types of economic subsistence, war, and housing that created new opportunities and challenges for the Pawnee and their neighbors. By the time American settlers started moving into the area during the 19th century, the settled agricultural chiefdoms with dense urban centers, organized militaries, and vast tributary economies had almost completely vanished and were replaced by empires of nomadic bison hunters, loosely organized along the lines of warrior societies and messianic prophets. The Pawnee, who had long benefited from and expanded under the old systems of chiefdoms, suffered terribly during this period at the hands of newly empowered enemies, which ultimately set the stage for their eventual alliance with the United States. The social power of disease goes back as far as human history, but there has never been a circumstance where the impacts of diseases were so profound as during the encounter between Native Americans and Europeans in the centuries immediately after 1492. The most devastating diseases that Europeans brought with them were zoonotic in nature, meaning that they had originated in domesticated animals and made the jump into humans during centuries of close contact between Europeans, Asians, Africans, and their various domesticated animals. These included smallpox, the flu, herpes B, encephalitis, rabies, anthrax, ringworms, the plague, cholera, dengue fever, the hantavirus, giardia, yellow fever, malaria, and chickenpox. The Europeans arrived with numerous protections from these diseases thanks to immunities passed in mother's milk, small genetic benefits, cultural knowledge about treatments, and immunities born out of childhood bouts. While Europeans also died in great numbers from these diseases, generally speaking they were spread out across the population of children who weren't immune, and since the Native Americans had no domesticated animals, they had few diseases to pass in turn. The only two major diseases in North America at the time were syphilis and gonorrhea. Since no Native Americans had immunity from European diseases, there was no concentration of illness among the young and the elderly, as is typical in populations with long-term exposure. In those situations, healthy adults can take care of the sick and ensure that important work like food production and defense continues, but Native Americans of all ages and genders were just as likely to become sick, and their illness was compounded by hunger and a lack of production. Weakened communities were no match for their enemies, whether they were Native American or white, and conquest only further spread contagion. In the end, an untold number of Native Americans died across the continent, and some have estimated that the death rate was as high as 80 to 90% of the affected populations. While the exact impact of these diseases upon the Pawnee before the 19th century is not recorded, archaeologists know that the urban settlements throughout the Mississippian world disappeared during this time, including the Caddoan chiefdom at Spiro. Along with that, there is no reason to believe the Pawnee fared better than other groups, and scholars do know that an 1849 cholera epidemic killed over 1,000 Pawnee, and an 1852 smallpox epidemic led to similar devastation. When De Soto's men passed from Florida through the southeast and into the Caddoan country, they encountered a seemingly endless array of prosperous, powerful settlements, but the Spanish didn't record many details for posterity. What they did note were the dense populations, rich agricultural lands, and prosperous towns that they saw, but when the next Europeans came through, French explorers this time, it was a century later, and their accounts of the Mississippi was of a landscape largely devoid of people and certainly lacking any centralized settlements. It's likely that this obliteration of a cultural tradition, not to mention the countless lives of its inhabitants, was due in large part to the wave of new diseases, and within years of contact with the Spanish, large Pawnee settlements were probably already disappearing. By studying other cultures, anthropologists have found that in situations where disease or other calamity wipes out a large percentage of the population, once the community has begun to recover emotionally and economically from the devastation, they tend to change their economic patterns to be less dependent on land. Their lower population levels allow them to support fewer people on more land, which means there's less need to use such labor-intensive techniques as fertilization, terracing, and irrigation, because they can leave lands to go fallow and rest for years at a time to recuperate their fertility. In conjunction with that, they can rely more upon wild foods, including both wild plants and game, without wiping out species near their settlements. The benefit to the participants in these changes is that they are able to subsist comfortably with less labor and a greater balance of interesting, prestigious labor like hunting as opposed to monotonous, back-breaking labor like terracing or digging irrigation ditches. For the Pawnee, the collapse of the old system meant they were able to maintain settlements only in the most prosperous farming areas and started to rely heavily upon wild food sources. By the time more Europeans arrived, the Pawnee had divided their time and energy between horticulture and hunting, and were heavily reliant upon the bison, though not to the extent of some even more nomadic groups. The lower amount of agriculture and the decrease in population density was heightened by the presence of the horse, which changed the economic calculus of the region. Suddenly, it was possible to follow the bison herds rather than wait for them to pass, and to move very quickly between agricultural villages and hunting camps. The amount of territory that a small group could control and patrol also increased massively. Militarily, it was possible to have fast-moving scouts track enemy actions, quickly send word for reinforcements or changes in strategy, bring up fresh warriors to battlefields, and perhaps most importantly, conduct lightning-fast raids deeper than ever before into enemy territories. It was now also possible for a military expedition to carry extra water and food and travel quickly across the plains, which meant there was no longer a need for fortified river settlements where a strong fortress at the river's mouth would protect all of the villages, farmland, and hunting areas upriver. The enemy could simply travel around these defenses and strike at the relatively unprotected upriver districts. The enemy could simply travel around these defenses and strike at the relatively unprotected upriver districts, cutting the fortifications off from their lines of support and making them ineffectual. In fact, the new nobility made for a change of tactics so vastly different than the preceding time that history has few strong comparisons, and as white settlers would eventually discover, many Native American groups churned out elite cavalrymen. Chapter 5. The Pawnee and the United States. From the 1540s until the early 19th century, the Mississippian world was destroyed and replaced by the societies that became among the most well-known on the Great Plains as semi-nomadic bison-hunting peoples. European contact during this period was intermittent and largely constrained to the French, who had claimed the entire river basin in 1682 when a small expedition led by René de la Salle explored and claimed the region as Louisiana. They founded the city of New Orleans in 1718, and St. Louis, almost on top of the ruins of ancient Cahokia, in 1764, but the French did not penetrate deeply into Pawnee territory, so their impact was primarily felt through the presence of trade goods like metal tools, such as hatchets, knives, and pots, firearms, and decorative goods like beads. In essence, the French took the place of the old Mississippian trading centers in the American bottom. This relatively passive French presence was replaced in 1803 by the far more active role of the United States of America after the French claim was bought by the Jefferson administration in the famous Louisiana Purchase. Just as the introduction of horses was heralded by the Coronado and De Soto expeditions, the Pawnee's contract with America began in earnest with the Lewis and Clark expedition, which knew about the group before passing through Pawnee territory. When they arrived in the valley of the Platte River, the heart of Pawnee lands, in the fall of 1804, the expedition was baffled by the empty landscape, unaware that the Pawnee were on their biannual bison hunt. As a result, their descriptions were scant, though they did notice the domed earthen lodges. Eventually, the expedition met with representatives of the Pawnee, and aware of the reality that they would soon run into the heart of the Plains tribes, the expedition planned to implement a system of protocol, one that had been established long before the journey. Jefferson had prepared Lewis well for the trip, and Lewis devised a chart listing 50 tribes and 19 questions to be answered about each. How effective this method proved is difficult to discern, but Lewis's methodical nature was very much in evidence. Upon any first encounter, Clark mentioned the laborious method of communicating with the native peoples they encountered. Upon reaching the first villages in early August 1804 around the present-day location of Omaha, Nebraska, the expedition had their first chance to commence with the state-sanctioned civilities that would guide their meetings and exchanges with the Plains groups. They handed out friendship medals, 15-star flags, and gifts, but at the same time, guns and the cannon on the keelboat were fired to convince the strangers of American military superiority. Food and other goods were also passed back and forth. However, the United States began to assert control over the western banks of the Mississippi over the next few decades, and artist George Catlin, who produced remarkable portraits of Pawnee and other groups, described the Pawnee during this time period. Pawnees are a very powerful and warlike nation, living on the River Platte about 100 miles from its junction with the Missouri, laying claim to and exercising sway over the whole country, from its mouth to the base of the Rocky Mountains. The present number of this tribe is 10 or 12,000, about one-half the number they had in 1832, when that most appalling disease, the smallpox, was accidentally introduced amongst them by the fur traders and whiskey sellers, when 10,000 or more of them perished. In addition to encroaching Americans, the Pawnee were hard-pressed not only by disease but also by a mounting number of enemies. By this time, they were engaged in near-continuous warfare with the Lakota Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Kiowa, and Comanche, all jockeying for power and land on the Great Plains. Both the Lakota and the Comanche were ascendant in the region, and they eventually formed powerful political and military systems that not only harassed the ability of the United States' expansion in the region for decades, but even threatened the federal government's control of the region before the Civil War. The Pawnee were further pressed in 1829 when the Lenape, Delaware people, originally from New Jersey, southern New York, and Connecticut, were displaced into reservations carved out of Pawnee territory. The addition of eastern indigenous groups like the Lenape increased the native population of the region by 33%, which strained the dispersed low-intensity subsistence strategies that the Pawnee had developed with horses. The two groups fought a nasty conflict until 1833, when the U.S. government agents orchestrated a peace between them, and the government also eventually negotiated a similar treaty between the Pawnee and the Kansa in the same year. The Pawnee were known by their enemies as the Wolf People, a reference to their ferocity, and even today the Pawnee Nation has a wolf head as its national symbol and runs a number of wolf-themed businesses, including the Stone Wolf Casino and Howler's Famous Barbecue. The accounts of both of these negotiations show how the Pawnee were feared by both their native and white enemies, and cultivated a reputation for barbaric fierceness that deterred their numerous foes. The Pawnee had no pride of dress. They were wrapped in shaggy robes and sat in silence, wild and uncouth in their appearance, with scowling brows and close-pressed mouths. The silence of the Pawnees was the hushed brooding of fury. Nevertheless, despite their calculated displays of ferocity, by 1833 the Pawnee were a shadow of their previous strength, with their population and territory depleted by decades of war and disease. That year, Pawnee leaders decided to surrender their territory south of the Platte River to the United States in exchange for promised lands in the new Indian Territory, the military and economic support of the United States, and jobs in the U.S. Army. That said, America was undoubtedly the winner in the 1833 treaty, as the country gained all of modern-day southern Nebraska and Pawnee-controlled northern Kansas, as well as disarming and gaining the services of one of the most fearsome indigenous groups in the Plains. The federal government aimed to simplify its relationships with all of the Native American groups, so it treated all of the Pawnee bands as a single entity, essentially creating a united Pawnee government for the first time by forcing the bands to cooperate. While the Pawnee worked out a peace with the U.S., other rivalries with Native American groups continued to fester. In the summer of 1852, the Cheyenne leader, Alights on the Cloud, decided to raid the Pawnee. Wearing a suit of captured Spanish metal armor, a family heirloom, he gathered up a large war party of Cheyenne, Kiowa, Lakota, Arapaho, and Apache and penetrated deep into Pawnee territory. His scouts found a Pawnee group already worn by battle with Kiowa warriors the day before, and he led his horsemen into a charge. Remarkably, a Pawnee archer shot Alights on the Cloud through the eye, and the Pawnee killed 6 other Cheyenne warriors, forcing the Cheyenne to retreat. However, the following summer, Little Robe, who had lost a son in the 1852 battle, assembled the Cheyenne warriors for revenge. They besieged a group of Pawnee at Beaver Creek, but their leader, Sky Chief, escaped and rallied an allied Pawnee band. These Pawnee were able to fire rifles in relay and drove back the Cheyenne and their allies. In the coming years, there would be a continuous tit-for-tat spate of revenge killings, raids, and attempts to steal horses and other resources. This constant warfare was typical of the Great Plains in the years before the American Civil War, and demonstrate how the mighty military power of the Pawnee was slowly ground to dust by their numerous enemies. The fortunes of the Pawnee continued to decline in the ensuing decades. Peace with the Kansa broke down in the early 1840s, leading to recriminations and massacres in the summer of 1842, but most of the details of this war were lost to history, even though American explorer John C. Fremont reported seeing a ravaged Kansa camp in June of that year. The epidemics of cholera in 1849 and smallpox in 1852 decimated the population, and the wars with the Lakota and other groups continued, even as the Pawnee were systematically disarmed and largely defenseless. Finally, in 1857, the exhausted Pawnee leadership signed the Treaty of Table Creek, in which they ceded the majority of their remaining territory, the northern half of Nebraska, to the U.S. in return for a small reservation on the Loup Fork of the Platte River and economic support. The American Civil War changed the balance of affairs in the plains, and though Native American groups sided with both sides of the conflict, the open battles did not occur in the plains. The Pawnee were organized into a small party of Union scouts by 1861, and their new allies, the Lenape, were particularly renowned for their aid to the Union Army. At the end of the war, the Union now possessed something it did not have before the war: an experienced, well-trained, well-armed, and disciplined military force that it could deploy against resistant groups in the plains, specifically the Lakota and Comanche, as well as more distant groups like the Apache in the Southwest. Moreover, the Union was driven by an ideology of unification, so the Army was utilized as a tool for extending federal power to its fullest extent. In addition to the Confederates, Native Americans and even the recalcitrant Mormons in Utah were targets of campaigns of conquest. Throughout the 1860s, the Pawnee, along with the Arikaras, Crows, and Shoshones, joined the U.S. Army in large numbers as scouts in order to fight against the Lakota. A particularly notable group was led by Major Frank North, which fought in the Civil War in 1864 and 1865, but also served notably against both the Lakota and the Cheyenne in the 1860s, and then again in the Lakota War of 1876 to 1877. While this alliance between Native Americans and their ostensible colonizers may seem strange today, the Lakota and Cheyenne were seen at the time as the true enemy, and Dunley observed that they often saw themselves as fighting, beside the best available allies, against bitter and frequently stronger enemies who constituted the greater immediate menace. They were also hired in the 1860s as guards for workers on the Transcontinental Railroad in Nebraska and Wyoming. In the summer of 1873, a group of about 400 Pawnee were returning from their traditional summer bison hunt and heading towards their Earth Lodge village on the Loup River, but at some point they realized they were being pursued and fled into a canyon, today called Massacre Canyon, where they found themselves outnumbered by 1,000 Lakota warriors. Lacking firearms after surrendering them in their peace negotiations with the United States, the Pawnee defended themselves with arrows, but to no avail. An American Indian agent traveling with the Pawnee wrote an account of what happened. On the 4th day of August, we reached the north bank of the Republican River and went into camp. At 9 o'clock that evening, 3 white men came into camp and reported to me that a large band of Sioux warriors were camped 25 miles northwest, waiting for an opportunity to attack the Pawnees for several days, anticipating that we would move up the river where buffaloes were feeding. Previous to this, white men visited us and warned us to be on our guard against Sioux attacks, and I was a trifle skeptical as to the truth of the story told by our white visitors. But one of the men, a young man about my age at the time, appeared to be so sincere in his efforts to impress upon me that the warning should be heeded that I took him to Sky Chief, who was in command that day, for a conference. Sky Chief said the men were liars, that they wanted to scare the Pawnees away from the hunting grounds so that white men could kill buffaloes for hides. He told me I was squaw and a coward. I took exception to his remarks and retorted, "I will go as far as you dare go. Don't forget that." The following morning, August 5th, we broke camp and started north up the divide between the Republican and the Frenchman rivers. Soon after leaving camp, Sky Chief rode up to me and extending his hand said, "Shake, brother." He recalled our little unpleasantness the night previous and said he did not believe there was cause for alarm, and was so impressed with the belief that he had not taken the precaution to throw out scouts in the direction the Sioux reported to be. A few minutes later, a buffalo scout signaled that buffaloes had been sighted in the distance, and Sky Chief rode off to engage in the hunt. I never saw him again. He had killed a buffalo and was skinning it when the advance guard of the Sioux shot and wounded him. The chief attempted to reach his horse, but before he was able to mount, several of the enemy surrounded him. He died fighting. A Pawnee, who was skinning a buffalo a short distance away, but managed to escape, told me how Sky Chief died. As the Pawnees' defenses began to falter, a Pawnee father placed his 5-year-old daughter on the back of his horse and gave her his family's peace medal and sacred bundle and sent the horse running through the melee in a desperate attempt to escape. Incredibly, the child survived and brought the sacred bundle back to the village, and she lived to adulthood before passing the bundle on to her daughter, Dolly, who kept the bundle all of her life until 1971. Dolly's daughter then gave the bundle to the Pawnee Indian Museum in 1987. As mentioned in an earlier chapter, the Kansas Historical Society now has that sacred bundle, and its history is fundamentally tied to the move of the Pawnee from Nebraska to Oklahoma. Due to tragic events like this, the Pawnee, finding themselves caught between the U.S. and the Lakota in a brutal war of attrition, came to realize that they could no longer sustain and defend themselves in their traditional lands, and had to accept the federal government's offer of protection in Oklahoma. In 1874, the Pawnee leadership decided that it could no longer sustain itself in the Nebraska Territory under threat from the Lakota and under pressure from white settlers. Strongly encouraged by the federal government, they signed a new treaty that surrendered their last Platte River territory and began a 2-year exodus to Oklahoma, the Indian Territory. The move to Oklahoma also involved the surrender of their traditional lifestyles. White Christian missionaries had been working in Pawnee territory since the 1830s, attempting to not only convert them to the new religion, but also to civilize them by forcing them to take up white governmental structures, housing, agriculture, and attire, but the traditional village structure based around the earth lodges remained remarkably stable throughout the 19th century. It was only after the move to Oklahoma, where they were no longer able to hunt bison, that the Pawnee were finally forced into white lifestyles, and even then many traditionalist Pawnee attempted to maintain their language, religion, and village institutions. In 1878, the last late summer dance of the Kurau doctors was organized, and in the late 19th century, the Kurau's guardians of the sacred bundles died without ceremonial heirs. The new reservation was on land previously assigned to the Cherokee between the Arkansas and Cimarron rivers, and it still makes up most of the Pawnee's lands today. The land was not particularly fertile, and the Pawnee struggled to support themselves through agriculture and cattle ranching. The government passed the Allotment Act in 1890 in an effort to eliminate the collective ownership of the reservation, so the best agricultural land was given to individual Pawnee families who were willing to farm it independently and live in isolated American-style farmhouses instead of collective villages. By removing the best land from collective agriculture, this further pressured those who remained on the collective land, eventually forcing the entire Pawnee Nation to take up individual allotments. At that point in 1893, the remainder of the land was removed from Pawnee ownership and sold off to white settlers. As a result, the Pawnee are only about 12% of the population of Pawnee County today, with the overwhelming majority of the rest of the population coming from European or American backgrounds. In 1891, the native peoples of the Great Plains were seized up in a messianic religious flurry around a movement called the Ghost Dance. Originating among the Paiute people, it was the first pan-Indian movement on the Great Plains since the arrival of Europeans and Americans. Wovoka, the prophet of the dance, taught that when a sufficient quantity of people joined a trance-like dance, they would be united with their dead and the whites would disappear. Wovoka also claimed that the dyed buckskin ghost dance shirts many wore were impervious to bullets, an assertion that was perpetuated by the ghost dance movement. The movement spread like wildfire, especially among the Lakota, where it eventually contributed to the massacre at Wounded Knee, and was adopted en masse by the Pawnee, who integrated the dance into a pre-existing sport called the hand game. The annual ghost dance and hand game remains a fixture in the Pawnee calendar even today, and has served as a reservoir for Pawnee identity and pride. The ghost dance also served as a platform for the revival of other traditions such as the men's societies, the doctors' dances, and other dances and games. The Aruska, or war dance, was revived at that time and continues to be performed, especially for returning Pawnee veterans of conflicts like World War II. The Pawnee had no autonomous, democratically elected government during the 19th century, as they were governed by an Indian agent appointed by the state. The primary concerns of the Indian agents involved crushing the remnants of indigenous culture, including polygamy, ceremonial feasting, holidays, dances, and gambling, and bringing the Pawnee into the American economic system. As a part of this system, many Pawnee children were forced to attend the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania and Hampton Institute in Virginia, both boarding schools that attempted to remove elements of Pawnee culture and language by isolating children from their families and traditions. Eventually, some boarding schools would open up in the reservation, and for decades the majority of Pawnee children attended these schools. In the 1920s, early American anthropologist Gene Weltfish lived amongst the Pawnee and wrote what is considered to be the definitive work on them from a scholarly perspective, The Lost Universe, Pawnee Life and Culture, 1965. She was amongst a wider community of anthropologists who became interested in Caddoan linguistics in the 1920s and 1930s, and who left an impressive amount of works about the Caddoan languages as well as grammatical analysis. Meanwhile, hunger and disease, especially due to unsanitary water sources, continued to plague the Pawnee during this time, and their population reached an all-time low in 1901 when there were only 629 surviving Pawnee. From that low point, the nation began a slow demographic recovery, but one victim of this massive decline was the Pawnee language. Out of a population of roughly 2,500 in 2007, only 10 individuals still speak the language, down from 79 in 2000. The Pawnee Nation has been developing teaching materials for introducing the language in the local high school, as well as for adult education, but it may be too late to save Pawnee as a community language. In 1936, the New Deal programs brought about a number of reforms that reversed the centuries-long assimilation trends of the state, including the Indian Reorganization Act and the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act. In 1937, the Pawnee voted to accept their first constitution, which included 2 organs of government, a business council and a chief's council, Nasharo, each having 8 members. The Business Council takes care of most of the day-to-day affairs of government, while the Chiefs Council is a more symbolic entity. Although the members of both institutions must be elected, the membership of the Chiefs Council is limited to those Pawnee who can prove descent from one of their ancient chiefly lines. This council and those family lines are an important form of continuity for the Pawnee people, connecting their current government with the ancient past. With the reassertion of autonomous government, the Pawnee people began to slowly break free from the cultural, economic, and political constraints the federal government had put upon them. During the 1930s, there was a campaign to have certain federal lands within Pawnee County transferred back to the Pawnee, a campaign that was finally successful in 1968. The nation acquired the abandoned Pawnee Indian School in 1962, and in 1980 they constructed a roundhouse based upon the model of an old earth lodge for communal dances and activities. Perhaps most importantly for their rebounding population, the Pawnee Nation has invested heavily in the Pawnee Hospital, first constructed in 1931. During World War II, the Pawnee provided a number of code talkers for the military operations. These individuals, all native speakers of Pawnee, worked as radio operators, and they would speak to other Pawnee code talkers in code in their native tongue. The double encoding of both a highly esoteric language and a code as well meant that the code talkers' transmissions were never broken. While the Navajo code talkers, the largest group to serve in the war, are quite well known, only as recently as 2013 have the Pawnee gained recognition for their participation in this project with a plaque from the U.S. Congress. Today, the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma continues to advocate for its members and protect their cultural traditions. The nation owns a number of businesses, including the Stonewolf Casino and Grill, which features slot machines but no table games, Howler's Famous Barbecue, the Stonewolf Deli, Stonewolf Travel Plaza, Trading Post Casino, and the Trading Post Retail Store. The nation continues many of its traditions, especially communal dances which are often done alongside military commemorations on Veterans Day or Memorial Day. There continue to be other forms of cultural revival as well, including a recent uptick in interest in constructing Earth Lodge buildings, a skill the Pawnee are learning from their Arikara cousins. Bibliography. Robert O. Lagace, Pawnee Culture Summary, Ethnographic Atlas, University of Kent, Canterbury. Howard Meredith, Dancing on Common Ground, Tribal Cultures and Alliances on the Southern Plains, Lawrence, University of Kansas, 1995. Hyde, George E., The Pawnee Indians, Norman, University of Oklahoma Press, 1974, ISBN 08061-20940. Weltfish, Gene, The Lost Universe, Pawnee Life and Culture, Lincoln, University of Nebraska Press, 1977, ISBN 08032-58712. This has been Native American Tribes, the History and Culture of the Pawnee. Written by Charles River Editors. Narrated by James Weipert. Copyright 2012 by Charles River Editors. Production copyright 2015 by Charles River Editors.